African-style shotgun houses made to stay cool in hot climates became common. Medicine, African herbal knowledge saved lives. Enslaved healers treated diseases with plants and techniques unknown to European doctors. Onesimus, an enslaved man in Boston, taught Cotton Mather about inoculation against smallpox, a technique he'd learned in Africa. Culture. African rhythms became the foundation of jazz, blues, rock and roll, reggae, salsa, and hip-hop. African cooking techniques and ingredients transformed American and Caribbean cuisine. African storytelling traditions were preserved and evolved into new forms. The wealth of the Americas was built not just on African labor, but on African knowledge. About 1/3 of transported Africans were women, and their experiences carried additional horrors that histories often minimize. Rape was systematic. Ship captains and crew routinely sexually assaulted women during the Middle Passage. On plantations, enslaved women were subject to constant sexual violence from overseers and owners. Enslaved women faced impossible choices: bear children who would be enslaved, or resist pregnancy, knowing you might be sold away from existing children. Yet they built communities, raised children in horrible circumstances, and transmitted African culture. In Africa, the trade created gender imbalances, since captive labor forces in the Americas needed more men for heavy agricultural work. Slave traders preferentially captured men. Some West African coastal regions had ratios as extreme as 70 women for every 30 men. Women took on roles traditionally held by men: farming, trading, community leadership. Some historians argue this created stronger traditions of female authority in certain African societies, but it came at the cost of demographic disaster. While the Atlantic trade gets the most attention, we must acknowledge that enslavement existed in Africa before Europeans arrived and continued alongside the Atlantic trade. The Trans-Saharan slave trade, run by Arab and North African merchants, had operated for centuries. It transported an estimated 9 million Africans from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East between 650 and 1900. The Indian Ocean slave trade, connecting East Africa with Arabia and India, transported another 4 million people between 800 and 1900. These trades were different from the Atlantic system in important ways. Slavery in Islamic and African societies was often less racialized. Enslaved people could convert and assimilate, and there was more possibility of freedom or social mobility. But suffering is suffering. Millions of Africans were enslaved, marched across deserts, and sold in Middle Eastern markets. Many died on the journey. The Atlantic trade was the largest and most destructive, but it wasn't the only one. The full story of African slavery is complex and painful. For over a century after the Atlantic slave trade ended, its history was deliberately obscured, minimized, and distorted. European and American historians wrote books describing slavery as benign, claiming enslaved people were happy, arguing they were better off than they would have been in Africa. They created elaborate racial theories to justify what had happened, claiming Africans were naturally inferior, suited for labor, incapable of civilization. These lies poisoned minds for generations. In Africa, colonial powers who had profited from the slave trade now claimed they were civilizing Africa. They destroyed or ignored evidence of Africa's sophisticated pre-colonial civilizations. African artifacts were stolen and locked in European museums. African history was dismissed as non-existent. The deliberate erasure of African achievement was an extension of the slave trade itself. Only in the mid-20th century, as colonialism ended and the civil rights movement gained strength, did historians begin seriously reconstructing the true history of the Atlantic slave trade and pre-colonial Africa. Modern genetic science has revealed hidden truths about the slave trade. DNA studies of African Americans show their ancestry comes from all along West and Central Africa's coast, reflecting the geographic spread of the trade. But DNA also reveals more painful truths: significant European ancestry in most African American populations, evidence of the systematic rape of enslaved women. DNA testing has allowed some descendants of enslaved people to trace their origins to specific African regions or ethnic groups. Families torn apart 400 years ago are discovering their connections. Economists have tried to calculate the monetary value stolen from Africa through the slave trade. The calculations are almost meaningless, because how do you price the value of a human life, of a destroyed civilization, of centuries of development that never happened? But even conservative estimates are staggering. Some historians calculate that the Atlantic slave trade extracted the equivalent of trillions of dollars in today's money from Africa in both labor and lost economic development. British profits from the slave trade helped finance the Industrial Revolution. American wealth, particularly in the South, was built on enslaved labor. Caribbean sugar made European merchants incredibly wealthy. Meanwhile, Africa was left depopulated, destabilized, and impoverished, setting the stage for the colonial conquest that followed immediately after the slave trade ended. The world we live in today, the wealth gaps between continents, the power imbalances, the lingering racism, all of this has roots in the Atlantic slave trade. Let's be clear about the numbers. Africa's population was growing before the Atlantic slave trade. Demographers estimate sub-Saharan Africa had about 50 million people in 1500. By 1850, after 3.5 centuries of slave trading, Africa's population was about 100 million. Sounds like growth, right? But if Africa had experienced the same population growth rate as the rest of the world during those centuries, it would have had over 200 million people by 1850. Africa lost over 100 million potential people, those who were taken, those who died in the process, and those who were never born because of the demographic collapse. Certain regions were hit harder. Angola lost an estimated 40% of its population. Parts of West Africa's coast were nearly depopulated. Some ethnic groups disappeared entirely. The gender imbalances created by preferentially capturing men meant population recovery was even slower. Fewer children were born. Social structures broke down. Some regions still haven't recovered. Parts of Central Africa have lower population densities today than they did in 1500. The Atlantic slave trade destroyed Africa's economic development in multiple ways. Selective removal of the productive population. The trade specifically targeted people in their prime working years, ages 15 to 35. These are the people who farm, innovate, build, have children, and drive economic growth. Imagine if every year the most productive workers in your country disappeared. What happens to your economy? Destruction of security. Constant raiding made long-term investments impossible. Why build a permanent house when you might be captured next year? Why clear new farmland? Why establish a workshop? The slave trade created a rational incentive for short-term thinking and insecurity. This killed economic development. Militarization, states that might have invested in education, agriculture, or trade infrastructure instead invested in weapons and armies. The arms race along the African coast absorbed resources that could have built schools, hospitals, and roads. Consider this. In 1500, West Africa and much of South Asia were at similar levels of development. Both had sophisticated kingdoms, extensive trade networks, advanced metallurgy, and growing economies. By 1850, India had been colonized. but was beginning to develop modern industries. West Africa was economically devastated, its population depleted, its political systems fractured. The Atlantic slave trade is the primary explanation for this divergence. Before the slave trade, Africa had large stable kingdoms: Mali, Songhai, Congo, Benin, Great Zimbabwe, and others. The slave trade destroyed these political structures. Large kingdoms broke into smaller warring states. Why? Because the slave trade rewarded militarization and conquest. Small, aggressive states could capture people from their neighbors and grow wealthy. Traditional alliances broke down, trust between communities evaporated. After all, your neighbor might raid you for captives. Political legitimacy shifted from providing security and prosperity to providing protection from slave traders. This political fragmentation left Africa vulnerable to the colonial conquest that followed. When Europeans arrived in the late 1800s with colonial ambitions, they found African societies already weakened, divided, and traumatized by centuries of slave raiding. The borders drawn by colonial powers, famously done with rulers on maps in Berlin in 1884 to 85, often reflected the fragmented political landscape created by the slave trade. Knowledge systems disappeared. Master craftspeople were captured and sold away. Oral historians who preserved generations of history were lost. Universities like Timbuktu declined as scholars fled slave raiders. Artistic traditions were interrupted. Agricultural techniques were forgotten when the farmers who practiced them were taken. Some languages died out entirely when their last speakers were transported across the Atlantic or killed. Other languages survived but lost their writing systems or sophisticated vocabularies. The African diaspora in the Americas preserved fragments of African culture, but fragments only. They created magnificent new cultures, blending African traditions with European and indigenous American influences. But what was lost in Africa can never be recovered. How do you measure the psychological impact of 3.5 centuries of terror? Multiple generations of Africans grew up knowing that at any moment they might be captured and sold. The constant fear, the breakdown of trust, the trauma of watching family members dragged away in chains. This didn't just affect individuals, it affected entire societies. Modern psychology recognizes intergenerational trauma, how trauma experienced by one generation affects subsequent generations through parenting practices, community structures, and even genetic changes. African societies experienced trauma on a scale almost impossible to comprehend, and that trauma didn't end when the slave trade stopped.